Sign immediately, you this foolish woman, or I will deal with you mercilessly.
The pen was shaking so badly in my fingers I thought it might fall out. I could barely see the words on the paper anymore because my tears kept dropping onto the glass table, smearing the ink and blurring my vision. The Lego sun was unforgiving that afternoon, bright, hot, exposing everything I wanted to hide. My trembling hands, my ruined makeup, my humiliation. And the man forcing me to sign wasn't an enemy. He was my husband. Michael stood behind me, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. One hand wrapped tightly around my wrist, the other guiding the pen downward like my hand no longer belonged to me. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was certain that this moment belonged to him. Behind us, 2 uniformed officers stood near the pillars, watching in silence. They didn't step forward. They didn't ask questions. They just stood there, as if my pain was part of the scenery. A few steps away, an elderly man in full judicial robes waited with a leather briefcase, his face empty of emotion. A witness, Michael had called him. Someone to make this theft look legal. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Michael, please. Slow down." My chest burned as memories crashed through me. Sleeping on warehouse floors in a papa, fighting port delays in one, building my company container by container while he smiled and called himself supportive. "You know I built this," I said through sobs. "I built everything." He laughed softly. Then he leaned closer and crushed the last piece of hope I had left. "Your father can't help you," he said. "That old man is finished. Abuja forgot him a long time ago." My lips trembled as I whispered the only thing I could still cling to. "My father won't allow this." Michael laughed out loud, the sound echoing across the courtyard. And at that exact moment, just as my forced signature touched the paper, I heard footsteps approaching from the gate. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Something in the air shifted. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if you believe betrayal should never win, hit subscribe, because what happened next changed everything. I wasn't born into power. No silver spoon.
No inheritance.
No safety net waiting quietly behind my name. Everything I had I built with my own hands, hands that blistered, cracked, and bled long before they ever signed billion-naira contracts. Before anyone called me Madam CEO, I was just a tired woman with a borrowed phone, a battered delivery van that broke down every other week, and a rented warehouse near a papa that smelled of diesel, sweat, and desperation. That was where it started. I remember those early mornings vividly. Lagos before sunrise has a certain kind of silence, heavy, uneasy, like the city itself is holding its breath. I would arrive at the warehouse before my drivers, unlock the rusted gate myself, and sit on overturned crates with a notebook balanced on my knees. While others slept, I studied. Shipping routes, port schedules, customs bottlenecks, the invisible politics of Nigerian trade that never appeared in textbooks. I learned which officers delayed containers for bribes, which routes flooded during rainy season, which ports swallowed profit if you weren't careful. I wasn't just moving goods. I was learning how Nigeria truly moved. There were nights I slept on cold concrete floors because it didn't make sense to drive home. Nights I cried quietly behind stacks of containers because a shipment had been seized or a deal had fallen apart at the last minute. I learned early that failure in business doesn't announce itself. It just shows up uninvited and demands that you respond or disappear. I responded. I took contracts others said were too small to matter. I took risks others were too comfortable to touch. I reinvested every kobo back into the business, while friends wondered why I still dressed simply, why I refused vacations, why I never slowed down. They didn't see what I saw. I wasn't chasing luxury. I was chasing independence. The kind no one could snatch from you when they got tired of you. A pawpaw led to tin can led to one. One warehouse became two. Two became a network. Local contracts turned into regional partnerships. Regional partnerships turned into multinational agreements spanning West Africa. Every expansion came with new resistance. Men who smiled at meetings and blocked me behind closed doors. Banks that doubted me until I proved them wrong twice. Partners who tried to squeeze me because they assumed I was desperate. I was never desperate. I was focused. When the numbers finally started climbing, when my company crossed thresholds people said a woman couldn't cross in this industry, I didn't celebrate the way people expected.
No champagne. No loud announcements.
I just sat alone in my office one night, lights off, staring at the city through the glass, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. I believed discipline had saved me. I believed faith had carried me. I believed consistency had protected me. What I didn't understand then was that success doesn't only attract opportunity. It attracts predators. Michael came into my life during one of the rare moments when I allowed myself to breathe. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He watched more than he spoke. He listened when I talked about work, really listened, and that alone felt rare enough to be special. He told me he admired my drive. Told me I was different, strong, exceptional. Words that sounded like respect but slowly became a mirror I leaned on more than I should have. In public, he called me his pride.
His queen.
He stood beside me at events, smiled for cameras, defended me in conversations where men tried to diminish my role. When people said I was too much, he said I was just enough. I mistook alignment for loyalty. I mistook admiration for safety. Behind closed doors, I kept building. I didn't hand Michael my company. I didn't ask him to save me. I simply let him stand close enough to see how everything worked. I talked openly about contracts, strategies, negotiations because I believed marriage meant partnership. I believed transparency was strength. I believed love meant shared burdens. I didn't notice when he started asking more questions than necessary. I didn't question it when he suggested small changes. For efficiency, he said. I didn't resist when he offered to handle things while I rested, while I recovered, while I slowed down for the first time in years. After my health crisis, after my body betrayed me in ways I hadn't prepared for, Michael became gentler, more attentive. He told me I'd done enough, that it was okay to lean on him, that everything I built was safe with him. I signed because I trusted him. That's the part people don't like to hear. They want betrayal to come with warning sirens, with obvious villains, with dramatic red flags waving in the wind. But most betrayals arrive dressed as relief, as love, as help. I didn't lose my empire because I was weak. I almost lost it because I believed the one person closest to me would never become my greatest risk.
Sitting there now.
My hand shaking, my signature forced onto paper, I finally understood something I wish I had learned earlier. No matter how high you build, no matter how hard you work, the most dangerous door is the one you leave unlocked for love. And the worst theft is the one that happens while you're still calling it trust. At first, Michael felt like shelter. After years of fighting the world with my shoulders squared and my guard up, being with someone who seemed proud of me felt like rest. He praised me openly, the way men rarely do when a woman's success threatens their own sense of importance. At dinners and industry events, he held my hand and introduced me as his wife with a smile that made people look twice. "This is my queen," he would say, and I would feel something soften inside me. For once, I wasn't defending my ambition. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't shrinking to make anyone comfortable. He told me he loved how driven I was. He said my mind fascinated him. He said watching me build my company inspired him. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. In those early days, he never asked me to slow down. He never complained about my schedule. When I worked late, he sent food. When I traveled, he checked in without suspicion. When I came home exhausted, he rubbed my shoulders and told me I was doing great. I mistook his presence for partnership. I mistook his admiration for alignment. The shift didn't come loudly. It never does. It came in the form of small comments, wrapped in concern. "You look tired," he'd say, his voice gentle. "You shouldn't push yourself this hard." At first, I thought it was care. Then it became, "Do you really need to take that meeting?" Then, why does everything always come back to work? The words sounded harmless, even loving, but they carried weight. Slowly, compliments turned into corrections. You talk too firmly sometimes, he'd say. People might misunderstand your tone. You don't need to handle everything yourself, he'd add. That's why you have me. When I shared wins, his smile lingered a second too short. When I talked strategy, he listened, but his eyes weren't curious anymore. They were calculating.
I didn't see it then.
I thought I was imagining distance where there was none. Behind closed doors, his concern started to feel like surveillance. He asked about every meeting, every call, every late night. Not directly. Never directly. He phrased it like interest, like support. Who are you meeting? Why so late? Do you trust them? Questions stacked on questions until I found myself explaining things that never needed explaining before. Then came the comparisons. You weren't like this when we met, he said once, casually, as if observing the weather. You used to make time for us. Sometimes I feel like I come second to your company. That one stuck. Because no woman wants to feel like she's failing at love, especially after building a life that already demands so much. I didn't want to be the kind of woman people whispered about, the one who chose money over marriage. I had fought too hard for respect to lose it at home. So, I adjusted. I answered calls faster. I shortened meetings. I softened my voice when I spoke about business around him. I stopped bringing work home, then stopped talking about it altogether. I told myself I was compromising. I told myself this was what balance looked like. What I didn't realize was that Michael wasn't asking for balance. He was testing boundaries. Every time I apologized for being busy, he learned where guilt lived inside me. Every time I justified a decision, he learned where doubt could be planted. Every time I chose peace over confrontation, he learned how far he could push without resistance. I still remember the first time he called me too strong. He said it with a laugh, like a compliment that didn't quite land. You're very independent, he said. Sometimes I wonder if you even need me. I rushed to reassure him. I told him I needed him emotionally. That partnership mattered more to me than power. That my company didn't replace love. I didn't see the satisfaction flicker across his face for a split second. I didn't understand that my reassurance was feeding something dangerous. From that day on, he leaned into it. Any time I stood firm, he framed it as aggression. Any time I disagreed, he called it stubbornness. Any time I made an executive decision without him, he said I was shutting him out. You don't have to prove anything anymore, he'd tell me. You already won. Won what? I wondered.
But I didn't ask.
Instead, I tried harder to be softer. I convinced myself patience was love's strongest language. I believed that if I endured quietly, things would settle. That marriages, like businesses, had seasons, highs and lows, adjustments. What I didn't understand was that Michael wasn't adjusting to me.
He was studying me.
He watched when I hesitated. He noticed when I second-guessed myself. He paid attention to the moments my confidence dipped, after hospital visits, after sleepless nights, after boardroom battles that drained more than they showed. He learned when I was tired. And he waited. I see it clearly now, sitting in that courtyard with my hand shaking under his grip. The marriage didn't break overnight. It shifted quietly, inch by inch, until the ground beneath me was no longer solid. Until love had been repurposed into leverage. Back then, I thought I was protecting my marriage by staying calm, by choosing understanding, by refusing to escalate small tensions. I didn't realize I was giving him time. Time to reposition himself. Time to turn my empathy into access. Time to mistake my silence for surrender. And by the time I sensed real danger, he had already mapped every weakness I didn't know I had. I thought patience would protect love. I didn't know patience in the wrong hands becomes permission. The first real crack didn't come from the business. It came from my body. I had always believed strength meant endurance, that as long as I pushed through, everything else would follow. So when the pregnancy became difficult, when my blood pressure spiked and my vision blurred, I treated it like another obstacle to manage. I worked from hospital beds. I took calls between tests. I told myself rest was temporary and weakness was not an option. Until one morning I tried to sit up and couldn't. The room tilted. My chest tightened. Nurses rushed in. Doctors spoke in voices that were calm on the surface and urgent underneath. Words like complications, monitoring, and risk floated above me like fog. For the first time in my adult life, my willpower wasn't enough to move my body. That terrified me more than I let anyone see. Michael was there. Always there. He slept in the chair beside my bed, his jacket folded neatly over the armrest. He held my hand during procedures. He spoke gently to the doctors, asked the right questions, nodded at the right moments. When relatives visited, they praised him endlessly. "You're lucky," they told me. "You chose well." I believed them. In those days, everything felt slow and heavy. My thoughts moved through syrup. Pain and medication dulled my sharpness, the edge I'd relied on for years. Decisions that once felt instinctive now felt overwhelming. That's when Michael started saying the words that would change everything. "Don't worry about work," he whispered one night, brushing my hair back from my face. "I've got it." "You need to focus on getting better," he said softly. "Let me carry the burden for now."
For now. Those words mattered.
He didn't come in with demands. He came with reassurance, with calm, with the tone of a man stepping up, not taking over. He told me the board needed continuity, that banks preferred stability, that clients hated uncertainty. All reasonable, all true. He framed it as protection for me, for the company, for our future. Then he brought the documents. Not thick contracts. Not anything that looked dangerous. Just forms. Approvals. Temporary authorizations. "This is so I can sign while you're here," he explained. "This one lets me speak on your behalf. This one's just to avoid delays." I was tired. So tired. My hand shook as I signed, not from fear, but from weakness. I didn't read as carefully as I always had. I didn't question clauses the way I normally would. I trusted the man sitting beside my bed, the man who kissed my forehead afterward and told me I was brave. I signed because I loved him. I signed because I was exhausted. I signed because I believed temporary meant temporary. I didn't know those signatures were keys. When I was discharged, recovery was slower than I expected. My body felt unfamiliar, unreliable. I moved carefully, thought carefully, and, without realizing it, I stepped back. Just a little. Enough for Michael to step forward. At first, nothing seemed wrong. He attended a few meetings for me, took a few calls, forwarded summaries at the end of the day. "Everything's under control," he'd say, smiling. I thanked him. I meant it. I told myself this was partnership. Then small things began to shift. An email I expected never arrived. A board meeting was rescheduled without my input. A bank alert didn't ping my phone. When I asked, Michael explained smoothly. "They called me first. It was quicker this way." I didn't want to disturb you.
Disturb me.
I didn't like that word, but I ignored the discomfort. I told myself I was healing. That delegation was growth. That strong leaders knew when to step back. But stepping back felt different when the space didn't stay open for you to return. Weeks passed, then months. I noticed I was copied instead of addressed, consulted instead of deciding. Information arrived filtered, summarized, softened. When I pushed for details, Michael reminded me of my health. "You don't need stress," he'd say. "Let me handle this." And because I still wasn't fully myself, because my body hadn't caught up with my ambition, I let him. The first time I realized something was truly wrong was when a longtime partner called me directly. His voice was hesitant. "I just wanted to confirm," he said, "that Michael has full authority now." Full authority. The words landed hard. I laughed it off on the call. Told him everything was fine. But when I hung up, my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. I confronted Michael that evening, gently.
Carefully.
I didn't accuse. I asked. He smiled.
Calm.
Patient. Of course I don't have full authority, he said. I'm just acting on your behalf. You sign the approvals. I reminded him they were temporary. So is your recovery, he replied. Let's not complicate things. That was the moment I felt the ground shift beneath my feet.
Still, I didn't fight. Not then.
I told myself clarity would come once I was fully back on my feet, that my strength would return, and everything would reset. I underestimated how quickly systems adapt to new centers of power. Board invitations stopped coming altogether. Bank communications went exclusively through Michael. Contracts were presented to me after they were already discussed. When I objected, I was told the decision had been made in my best interest. My best interest. The phrase became a cage. Every time I reached for control, it slipped just beyond my grasp. And the more I reached, the more Michael tightened his hold, subtly, legally, invisibly.
No shouting. No scenes.
Just procedure. Paperwork. Authority backed by signatures I didn't remember giving. By the time my body fully recovered, my position hadn't. What I thought was delegation had become displacement. What I thought was rest had become removal. And what I believed was a temporary sacrifice had turned into a quiet takeover happening right in front of me, one I didn't recognize until reversing it required more than strength. It required confrontation. Sitting in that courtyard now, my hand shaking under Michael's grip, I finally understood the cruel elegance of what he'd done. He hadn't stolen my company in one dramatic move. He had waited until I was weakest, wrapped control in care, and convinced me that surrender was love. I thought I was healing. I didn't know I was being replaced. I wish I could say the moment I truly understood came with fireworks, an obvious betrayal, a shouting match, a slammed door. But it didn't. It came in fragments. In the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. In the way people began to ask Michael for approval while I stood right beside him. In the way my own staff, people who used to look at me like I was the sun, started to look at me like I was a complication. And then it came in the strangest way of all, an invitation. Michael told me we needed to finalize a few outstanding items at the Lecky house. He said it the way someone talks about renewing a car license. Routine.
Necessary.
No drama. He wore a clean shirt, his watch shining, his voice soft as if softness meant safety. Just come, he said. Let's clear this up once and for all. You'll feel better when it's done. Once and for all. Even then, I still wanted to believe he was going to make things right. That he was going to hand back what was mine and call it a misunderstanding. That he was going to look me in the eyes and remember that I wasn't just a balance sheet. I was his wife. But the closer we got to Lecky Phase 1, the heavier my chest felt. The mansion itself always looked like a trophy. Glass, marble, tall pillars, clean lines, security gates that opened like they were greeting royalty. When I built my first warehouse near Apapa, I used to look at places like this and think, one day. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted proof that my suffering had produced something solid. Now, as the gate slid open and the compound swallowed our car, that same mansion felt like a courtroom without a judge. Beautiful, silent, and designed to make you feel small. Michael didn't park where we usually parked. He drove deeper into the courtyard, toward the outdoor sitting area, where the marble floors reflected the sun like a mirror. Everything was too clean, too arranged. Like a set. I noticed the staff first. They weren't moving freely the way they normally did.
No casual greetings. No chatter.
No laughter drifting from the kitchen. Just bodies positioned like furniture. A housekeeper stood near the corridor with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes lowered. A gardener lingered by the palm trees without touching a single tool. When I tried to catch anyone's gaze, their eyes slid away as if looking at me would cost them something. My throat dried. Then I saw the table. The glass surface was spotless, so polished it looked like water. Neat stacks of documents sat in perfect alignment, corner squared, as if someone had measured the angles. 3 pens were placed beside the papers, each one positioned like a choice I wasn't actually being offered. There was even a small leather folder opened at the edge of the table, waiting. It wasn't a meeting setup. It was an execution table dressed as professionalism. I heard voices and turned. Two men stood near the far pillar, dressed in uniforms that made my stomach twist. Nigerian police-style uniforms, stiff and official, but something about them felt staged, too new, too crisp, too eager to look authoritative without the ease of real duty. They weren't holding weapons openly, but their posture was all message. We are here. We are watching. Don't try anything. Private security, Michael said casually, like he was pointing out a new flower arrangement. Just for safety.
Safety.
I almost laughed at the word, but it died in my throat. Then the robed man stepped into view. He was older, stern-faced, with a posture that carried years of courtroom confidence. Full judicial robes in broad daylight, as if he had walked out of a tribunal and into my marriage. He held a leather briefcase at his side, his expression calm, unreadable, professional in a way that felt brutal. When he glanced at me, it wasn't with empathy. It was with assessment. Like I was a signature he needed to secure. "Good afternoon, madam," he said, voice neutral. Michael greeted him warmly, almost respectfully. That was when the panic rose. Not loud panic. Not screaming panic. The kind that sits under your ribs and makes every breath shallow. The kind that tells you are stepping into something you cannot simply talk your way out of. I looked back at Michael, searching his face for softness, for hesitation, for any sign that he felt even a pinch of guilt. He smiled gently, gentle enough to fool an audience, not gentle enough to comfort a wife. "Let's sit," he said. The sun was brutal overhead, blazing down on the marble, the heat bouncing up into my face. Lagos traffic hummed faintly beyond the high gates, the sound of horns and movement reminding me that a whole city was living life normally while mine was being rearranged behind walls. I sat because my legs felt unsteady. The chair was cool at first, then instantly hot as the sun pressed against everything. I placed my hands on my lap, but they wouldn't stop trembling. I tried to calm myself. I tried to think. I tried to remember every legal detail I had ever learned, every contract clause, every board procedure. But fear has a way of shrinking your mind until only one thought remains. Get out. Michael placed the documents in front of me slowly, like a man offering a gift. "This is just the final step," he said. "You've already agreed to most of it." I stared at the first page and felt my vision blur. Company letterhead. Legal language. Numbers. My company's name printed like a brand on paper that was about to become my cage. "I didn't agree to this," I whispered. Michael's smile didn't fade. "Isabella," he said softly, like he was soothing a child.
Please.
"Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked at the robed witness. He didn't move.
He didn't react.
He was a statue with a briefcase. I looked at the uniformed men. They stared straight ahead, but their presence pressed in like hands on my shoulders. Then Michael leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know how this works," he murmured. "If you fight, it becomes messy.
Public.
The banks will freeze things. The board will panic. Investors will run. You'll be painted as unstable, emotional. And you know how they love that story." My stomach turned. I tasted metal in my mouth. He was speaking gently, but every word was a blade. I reached for the papers, not to sign, but to pull them toward me so I could read properly. Michael's hand landed on my wrist, not hard yet, but firm enough to remind me that he controlled the pace. His fingers were warm. My skin felt cold beneath them. "Don't," he said, still smiling. "Everything is prepared."
Prepared.
That word again. Like I was walking into a plan that had been rehearsed without me. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed the final detail that made my heart sink. There were no phones. Not on the table. Not in anyone's hands. Staff who always had something tucked into their aprons stood empty. Even Michael's phone, the one that never left his palm, was nowhere in sight. "You collected phones?" I asked, my voice small. Michael shrugged. "Just to prevent distractions." This is serious. Serious. I wanted to stand up, to run, to scream, to demand someone call my lawyer. But the courtyard was too open and too controlled. The walls were too high. The air felt too thick. And the people around me, my staff, the uniformed men, the robed witness, were all acting like this moment was normal. Like I was the abnormal part for resisting. Michael slid a pen toward my hand. It was a beautiful pen. Heavy.
Smooth.
Expensive. The kind of pen you use for historic signings. The kind of pen you remember. My hand hovered over it. My fingers shook so badly I couldn't pretend I was fine anymore. Tears stung my eyes. Not loud tears, just the kind that rise when your body realizes your dignity is about to be taken in daylight. Michael's voice softened even more, almost tender.
Sign it, he said.
And we both walk away clean. I looked up at him one more time, praying for the man I married to appear. But his eyes never softened. They stayed cold, focused, fixed on the outcome. He wasn't asking. He was executing. And as I sat there in that glass and marble courtyard, the sun blazing, the traffic humming beyond the gates, I finally felt the trap close completely, silent, legal, and perfectly staged, while my life's work lay on the table in front of me like a body waiting for burial. My fingers hovered above the pen like it was hot metal. For a second, I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else. Louder than the distant hum of traffic outside the gate, louder than the faint rustle of palm leaves, louder than the shallow breaths the staff were trying to hide. I stared at the first line where my name was already printed, bold and confident, like the paper was mocking me. Michael's hand was still wrapped around my wrist. Not violent yet, just firm, possessive. A reminder that I was not alone at that table, and that what happened next would happen on his timing. I need to read it, I whispered. His grip tightened. It was subtle, but pain shot up my arm, sharp enough to make me inhale too quickly. He leaned closer until his breath warmed my ear, and his voice dropped into something intimate and cruel, like a lover sharing a secret. You've read enough, he murmured. This is family property now. I blinked, stunned by the words. Family property. As if the nights I slept on cold warehouse floors were family property. As if the years I swallowed fear at the ports, negotiated with men who looked at me like I didn't belong, prayed through customs delays and theft scares and staff strikes. Family property. As if my body, my brain, my sacrifice could be stamped and claimed because I wore a ring. I built this, I said, my voice shaking. Michael, I built it. He smiled without warmth, the corner of his mouth lifting like he enjoyed watching my dignity crumble. You built it, he repeated softly, as though I'd said something childish. And then you got too proud. The word hit me like a slap.
Proud.
As if success in a woman was arrogance. As if my strength was a sin that needed correcting. My eyes stung. Tears surged fast, humiliating and unstoppable. I hated that my body betrayed me in front of them, his witnesses, his uniforms, his silent staff. The first tear dropped onto the paper and spread, darkening the ink. Then another. My mascara began to run, hot lines down my cheeks, and I wiped at my face with the back of my hand like that could erase what was happening. Please, I whispered, and the word tasted bitter. Please don't do this. Michael's fingers dug deeper into my wrist. He angled my hand toward the paper, guiding me like I was a child learning to write. The pen trembled between my fingers, not because I was weak, but because my body knew it was being forced into surrender. Stop, I said again, louder this time, desperation cracking through my voice. Michael, I'm your wife. He laughed under his breath. Not a big laugh. Not yet. Just a low, amused sound that vibrated with contempt. My wife, he said, wouldn't fight me like this. I felt something inside me snap, not into rage, but into clarity. This wasn't negotiation. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was punishment. This was him enjoying the moment he finally got to make me small. I looked past him toward the staff, hoping, ridiculously, heartbreakingly, that someone would move, that someone would speak, that someone would remember I had paid their salaries, supported their families, attended their weddings, helped bury their parents, sent money when illness struck. But every face was turned away. Every body was still. They were prisoners too, and they had chosen survival over loyalty. The robed man sat quietly, hands folded, eyes lowered to the documents like a man waiting for a train schedule to align. The uniformed officers stood where they were, planted like pillars. The courtyard might as well have been sealed in glass. Michael slid the paper closer and tapped the signature line with his free hand.
Sign, he said.
My throat burned. I tried to pull my wrist back, just an inch, but his grip tightened until my bones ached. He leaned in again, and this time his whisper was pure poison. If you keep this up, he murmured, I will make you a public spectacle. The banks will freeze your accounts. We will announce a restructuring. The board will say you stepped aside for health reasons. You know how quickly Lagos turns a woman into a joke. My breath broke. A sob rose up, and I swallowed it, choking on it. You can't, I whispered. You can't erase me like that. His eyes stayed calm. That's where you're wrong, he said, still quiet, still controlled. I can, and I will. I shook my head, tears falling faster now, splashing onto the contract, blurring words I had once been proud to sign, deal documents, expansion approvals, contracts that grew my empire. Now my tears were ruining ink like my life was being erased in real time. My father, I said, because desperation reaches for anything. My father would never allow this. That was when Michael laughed loudly. It burst out of him, sharp and echoing, cutting through the courtyard like a whip. The staff flinched. One of the housemaids startled and looked up before quickly lowering her gaze again. Even the robed witness's eyes flickered, just briefly, as if the sound was too raw to ignore. Your father? Michael repeated, still laughing. Isabella, your father is finished. He said it like a verdict. Finished, he went on louder now, making sure everyone heard. Retired. Irrelevant. A man who couldn't even keep his relationship with his own daughter intact. What is he going to do? Call Abuja? Please. My cheeks burned, not just from shame, but from the exposure of something private. The distance between me and my father turned into entertainment. He enjoyed that too. You see, Michael said, voice smoothing again, you always thought you were special because you had him behind you. But he's not behind you. He's nowhere. The words stabbed deeper than the contract. Because they carried a truth I hated. My father and I had been distant for years, our conversations stiff, our love buried under pride and silence. Michael had watched that distance, studied it, and now he was using it like a weapon. I looked down at the line again. My name, the space for my signature, the moment the world would record as consent. My fingers refused to move. Michael's patience evaporated. His hand clamped around mine, harder this time, and he pressed the pen into my grip until my knuckles whitened. Pain surged through my wrist. My breath hitched. Michael, I gasped. Enough, he hissed, the first true crack of anger in his voice. You want to drag this? You want to embarrass yourself?
Fine.
And then, in front of everyone, he forced my hand down. Not just guiding, forcing. The pen tip touched paper, and I felt the moment like a wound. My hand shook, trying to resist, but his strength overpowered mine. My signature began to form in crooked, broken strokes. My identity dragged across the page like it didn't belong to me. No, I sobbed, the sound slipping out before I could stop it. Please, please. Tears dropped directly onto the ink, and the letters smeared slightly, as if even the paper couldn't hold the lie cleanly. Michael pressed harder, grinding my hand across the line until the final stroke landed. It was done. My signature sat there, trembling and wet, like a bruise on white paper. For a moment, everything went silent. The courtyard held its breath. The staff stood frozen. The uniformed men didn't move. The robed witness reached forward calmly, as if collecting a routine document, and placed his fingers on the page. I stared at what I had just signed, my chest heaving, my face wet, my wrist throbbing. I felt stripped, not just of my company, but of my voice. my dignity, my right to say no. Michael released my wrist like he had finished using it. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, and looked at me as though I was no longer a person, just a problem he had solved. "See," he said softly, "that wasn't so hard." My throat tightened around a scream I couldn't afford to release. I wanted to leap across the table. I wanted to rip the paper in half. I wanted to rewind time to the first moment he ever asked me to trust him. But all I could do was sit there, shaking, staring at my smeared signature, proof of my surrender written in broad Nigerian daylight, while the man I married smiled like he had won. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the humiliation and the sobs, a different feeling began to rise, small at first, almost impossible to name. Not hope, not yet, just a quiet, burning certainty that this story was not ending with my signature. Michael's confidence didn't come from luck. It came from certainty. And that certainty had a name. My father, Richard Williams. Michael believed, no, he knew, that my father no longer mattered. He said it often, casually, like a fact so obvious it didn't need defending. And the truth is, for a long time I had believed it too. Not because my father was weak, but because distance has a way of shrinking even the strongest figures when silence stretches long enough. My father was not a man of soft words. He never knew how to comfort. He loved through structure, through expectations, through restraint. Growing up, affection came in the form of discipline. Praise was rare. Correction was constant. When I succeeded, he nodded. When I failed, he withdrew. And when I became an adult, strong, independent, busy, we drifted into a relationship built on brief calls and formal conversations. There were no dramatic fights between us.
No final argument.
Just years of emotional distance that settled quietly, like dust no one bothered to clean. Eventually, I stopped expecting him to show up. Michael noticed that. He noticed how my shoulders stiffened when my father's name came up, how I avoided talking about him, how I never mentioned him at board meetings or business dinners the way some people flaunted their powerful parents. Michael paid attention to those details the way a hunter studies tracks. And he used them. "Your father hasn't called you in months," Michael said once, pretending concern. "He never shows up for you," he added another time, his voice almost gentle. "If he really cared," he said once, shrugging, "wouldn't he be closer?" I never defended my father. Not out loud. I didn't have the energy. I told myself independence meant not needing rescue. I told myself I had built everything without him, so it didn't matter. Michael took my silence as confirmation. By the time we sat in that courtyard, my wrist aching, my signature smeared on paper, Michael was fully convinced that Richard Williams was a ghost. A retired man with no relevance. A former official whose influence had expired the moment he left office in Abuja. He said it again after forcing my signature, his voice loud enough to sting. "Your father can't touch this," he said, smiling. "He's done." What Michael didn't know, what none of us in that courtyard knew, was that while he was congratulating himself, history was being rewritten less than 700 kilometers away. In Abuja, that same afternoon, my father sat in the Senate chamber, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Years of silence had trained his face into something calm and impenetrable. When his name was called, it echoed through the hall. Formal, deliberate, final. Richard Williams. The room rose. Applause followed, not the polite kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that signals authority being handed over, not borrowed. The oath was administered. Words were spoken that carried the weight of the Constitution. And just like that, the man Michael dismissed as finished became the Attorney General of the Federation. No cameras rushed to Lekki. No headlines flashed across my phone. No alert warned Michael that the ground beneath him had cracked. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly. My father didn't make celebratory calls. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't send press releases. He didn't even notify me.
Not yet.
He listened.
He observed.
He asked questions that didn't sound like questions. He received information with the patience of a man who understood timing. And somewhere in the middle of all that, A report crossed his desk. A private matter, flagged by procedure. A legal transaction involving coercion. A contract executed under duress. Surveillance footage mentioned. Uniformed officers present without formal mandate. A name attached to the documents that made his eyes pause just long enough for the room to disappear. My name, Isabella. The distance between us, the years of silence, the pride, the missed calls, collapsed into irrelevance in that instant. Not because he suddenly became sentimental, but because something more powerful than emotion had been triggered. Principle. My father had never been the kind of man who rushed into situations driven by feelings. He believed justice worked best when it arrived prepared, when arrogance had already overplayed its hand, when evidence was complete and excuses were exhausted. So he didn't call me. He didn't warn Michael. He didn't stop what was happening in the courtyard at the exact moment it happened. He let it finish. Because men like Michael don't learn from interruptions. They learn from consequences. By the time I sat there shaking, staring at my smeared signature, my father was already in motion. Security briefings. Legal confirmations. Quiet authorizations. Vehicles arranged, without sirens. Orders given without noise. The irony would have been almost poetic if it hadn't been so cruel. The man Michael mocked for being absent was, at that very moment, the most powerful legal authority in the country. And Michael, so proud, so confident, so certain he had calculated every variable, had made one fatal mistake. He had mistaken emotional distance for powerlessness. He had mistaken silence for irrelevance. He had mistaken a man who waits for a man who is finished. By the time the courtyard felt calm again, by the time Michael leaned back, satisfied, already tasting victory, the balance had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. And neither did I. All I knew was that something in the air felt different. Not hopeful, not triumphant, just heavy, like the kind of silence that comes right before footsteps are heard. The sound came before I saw anything. Footsteps. Not hurried, not uncertain, slow, measured, heavy enough that the marble beneath them seemed to listen. At first, I thought it was my mind breaking under the weight of what I had just lost. I was still staring at the contract, at my smeared signature, at the way the ink had bled like a wound that refused to close. Michael had reached for the final page, already turning it with the ease of a man who believed the story was over. Then the footsteps grew closer. One by one, heads turned. The staff froze. The uniformed men stiffened. Even the robed witness, who had been calm, detached, almost bored, straightened in his seat like something in his body had recognized authority before his mind caught up. I lifted my head slowly. Through the open gate, framed by sunlight and shadow, my father walked in. Richard Williams. For a heartbeat, I didn't breathe. He looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. The same tall posture. The same disciplined stillness in his face. But now he wore something else too, something heavier than fabric. Authority. Not loud. Not aggressive. The kind that reshapes rooms without asking permission. Federal security flanked him, their presence quiet but undeniable. They didn't rush. They didn't skin wildly. They moved like men who already knew where control belonged. Michael's hand froze midair. His smile, so confident moments earlier, collapsed slowly, as if someone had drained the strength from it drop by drop. He turned in his chair, disbelief flickering across his face before he masked it with forced amusement. "Richard," he said, standing halfway, trying to laugh. "This is unexpected." I couldn't move. Tears clung to my lashes, blurring my vision. I blinked hard, convinced this had to be a hallucination. My father hadn't announced himself. He hadn't called. He hadn't warned me. He had simply appeared, solid, undeniable, like reality correcting itself. He didn't look at Michael first. He looked at me. Just once. No words.
No apology. No reassurance.
Just a steady look that said, "I see everything." Then he turned his attention to the table. "May I see the documents?" he asked.
His voice was calm.
Not raised. Not angry. but it carried across the courtyard with a clarity that made the air feel thinner. Michael hesitated for half a second too long. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly. "This is a private family matter." My father didn't argue. He simply extended his hand. The robed witness swallowed hard and slid the contract forward before Michael could stop him. My father took the papers, flipped through them slowly, methodically, as though time itself had decided to wait for him. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure everyone could hear it. He stopped at the signature page. At my signature. The one written through tears. The one guided by force. The one that had felt like a burial. My father studied it carefully. Then he lifted his eyes. "This was signed under coercion," he said. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Silence crashed down so suddenly it felt violent. Even the birds in the compound seemed to disappear. Michael opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That's absurd," he said, his voice sharper now. She agreed. She. My father raised a hand. Just slightly. And Michael stopped talking. "Uniformed officers without formal authorization," my father continued, his tone unchanged. "A legal witness present during an act of duress. Estate surveillance cameras actively recording. A signature executed while the signatory was physically restrained." Each sentence landed like a stone. "This contract," my father said, lowering the papers to the table, "is not binding. It is evidence." Michael took a step back. "That's not how this works," he said, louder now, panic bleeding through his confidence. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," my father said quietly. And for the first time, Michael looked past him, at the security detail, at the way their posture had shifted, at the way the uniformed men he had hired no longer looked aligned with him. My father turned slightly. "Preserve all surveillance footage," he said. "Secure all electronic devices on the premises. No one leaves until statements are taken." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The courtyard exploded into motion. Phones were collected. Staff were gently but firmly directed aside. One of the uniformed men stepped toward Michael, not aggressively, but decisively. Michael laughed once, sharp and desperate. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I have connections in Lagos. This is a misunderstanding. Isabella, tell him." I stood up. My legs shook, but I stood. My chair scraped loudly against the marble, and every sound felt amplified. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing the last of my tears, and for the first time that day, my voice didn't break. "I said no," I said. Michael stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "She said no," my father repeated. The officer stepped closer to Michael. "Sir," he said, "you are under investigation for spousal coercion, corporate fraud, and conspiracy to illegally seize assets." Michael's mouth opened, then closed. His face drained of color. "This is insane," he whispered. "Richard, we can talk about this." My father finally looked at him fully. "There is nothing to discuss," he said. "You had every opportunity to stop." The robed witness quietly opened his briefcase and removed additional documents, warrants already signed, already prepared. Michael's knees seemed to buckle just slightly as the realization settled in. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Michael reached for me again instinctively, like control was muscle memory. An officer stepped between us instantly. I felt something inside me release. Not joy. Relief. The kind that leaves you weak after holding your breath too long. As Michael was escorted away, still talking, still insisting, still clinging to the illusion of power, my father turned back to me. He didn't hug me. He didn't dramatize the moment. He knelt slightly, so we were eye level. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore," I said. He nodded once, satisfied. Behind us, the contract lay on the table, no longer a weapon, just paper. Evidence. Proof of how arrogance signs its own downfall when it believes no one is watching. As the courtyard filled with controlled chaos, I realized something that made my chest ache in an entirely new way. I hadn't been saved because I was weak. I had been saved because the law finally caught up to the lie. And for the first time since my hand had been forced to that page, I felt something settle into place. The door hadn't just opened. Everything had changed. For a few seconds after my father said the word evidence, the courtyard felt like it had been unplugged from time. The heat was still there, the sun still burning the marble bright enough to hurt my eyes, but something invisible had shifted, like the air itself had decided it no longer belonged to Michael. He tried to fill the silence the way he always did, with confidence performed loudly enough to drown out. He laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because laughter had always been his weapon of choice, his way of turning fear into a joke before it could turn into judgment. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said, spreading his hands like a man caught in an overly dramatic misunderstanding. "Richard, come on. You know how these things look from the outside. Husband and wife arguing.
Papers.
Emotions. It's Lagos. People will always exaggerate." No one laughed with him. The two uniformed men he had planted behind me weren't standing like bodyguards anymore. Their shoulders had shifted. Their eyes weren't on me. They were on him. Not protective. Assessing. My father didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the closest federal officer and nodded once, like a signal that had been agreed on long before anyone walked through that gate. Then things started moving. Phones first. A federal agent approached the staff, calm, polite, and firm. "All mobile devices," he said. "Please place them on the table." One by one, hands reached into pockets. Even the house manager, who had been avoiding my eyes all afternoon, dropped his phone down with a trembling finger. Another agent stepped toward the two uniformed men Michael had hired and asked for identification. Not loud. Not disrespectful. Just direct. The question alone stripped something from them. The power of pretending. Michael watched all of it with a smile that was starting to crack at the edges. Okay, he said, voice higher now. "Let's all relax. There's no need to turn this into some federal drama. Isabella and I can sort this out privately. It's our marriage. Our company."
Our
company? I heard myself whisper, and even that small sound felt like breaking glass. Michael turned toward me too quickly. "Don't start," he warned softly, like we were still alone, and he could still manage my fear with a look. But we weren't alone. And the look didn't land the way it used to. Because for the first time, there were men in this courtyard whose loyalty could not be purchased with charm, and whose silence could not be negotiated with threats. The robed witness cleared his throat quietly, almost like he wanted to disappear. Then, as if remembering his role, he opened his briefcase again. Leather creaked in the heat. Paper edges shifted. What he pulled out wasn't a simple affidavit. It was a stack of emergency warrants, already prepared, already signed, already official enough that even the word connections sounded childish beside them. Michael's smile failed completely. His eyes widened, then narrowed, as his mind tried to catch up to the fact that this wasn't an interruption. It was an ambush. He took a step toward the witness. "What is that?" he demanded. "Who authorized this?" The witness didn't answer Michael. He looked at my father. And my father, still calm, still painfully controlled, spoke like a man who had spent years watching power pretend it was untouchable.
"I did," he said.
Michael's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I saw the panic now. Not the panic of a man afraid for his wife's feelings. The panic of a man watching the ground disappear beneath his feet while still trying to stand tall. He turned to the officers as if switching audiences would bring back control. "Gentlemen, let's be reasonable," he said, forcing that smooth tone again. "You know Lagos. You know how business works. This is a corporate matter disguised as a family issue. Isabella signed willingly. She's emotional. She's been under stress. That's all." A federal agent, expression unreadable, glanced down at the contract on the table, then at my face, then at Michael's hand, still hovering too close to where my wrist had been pinned minutes ago. "Ma'am," the agent said to me gently, "were you forced to sign?" The question hit me like cold water. I opened my mouth and no sound came out at first, because admitting the truth meant admitting something I had tried to deny for years, that the man I married wasn't just flawed, he was dangerous when he wanted something. I nodded. Yes, I said, and my voice shook once before it steadied. He forced me. Michael's head snapped toward me. What? He barked, sharp enough that the staff flinched. Isabella, don't be stupid. Think about what you're saying. My father's gaze hardened, just slightly, and that tiny shift was terrifying in a way shouting could never be. Watch your tone, he said. Michael laughed again, but it came out wrong, broken at the edges. This is unbelievable, he said. I built this life too. I'm her husband. Do you understand what you're doing? You'll embarrass yourself. You'll embarrass your father. You, my father interrupted, have already embarrassed yourself. The federal agents moved with quiet coordination. One stepped toward the CCTV control area. Another began photographing the table, the documents, my smudged signature. Someone asked the house manager for the security storage. Someone else spoke into a radio in clipped, calm phrases. It looked rehearsed, like everyone here had been waiting for the exact moment Michael thought he had won. And Michael felt it too, because his voice started rising, climbing as his control slipped. This is my house, he shouted. This is my private property. You can't just come in here and start seizing. It is not your house, my father said, still quiet, still calm. It is a crime scene. The words landed like a slap. Michael froze. He stared at my father as if searching for the old version of him. The retired man he could dismiss, the distant father he could mock, the influence he believed ended in Abuja. But the man standing in front of him now was not retired. He was appointed. And the men beside him did not move for Michael's anger. They moved for authority. Michael's chest rose and fell faster. I know people, he said, voice dropping into a desperate, threatening whisper. In Lagos. In Abuja. You don't want this to become ugly. My father tilted his head slightly, like he was studying a child who had finally spoken nonsense out loud. It became ugly, he said, the moment you put your hands on my daughter. Michael's eyes flashed with something wild. He turned toward me in a final attempt to reclaim something. Isabella, he said, stepping forward, reaching for my arm the way he always did when he wanted to remind me who he believed I belonged to. I instinctively flinched. But before his fingers could touch my skin, an officer stepped between us. Clean, immediate, non-negotiable. Sir, the officer said, firm and even, step back. Michael stopped mid-reach, like he'd hit a wall. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at the officer's arm blocking him, and for the first time, I saw it. The shock of being denied. Not argued with. Denied. As the officer guided him back, not rough, not dramatic, just controlled, Michael's face twisted. His pride fought to survive the humiliation. Don't touch me, he snapped. The officer didn't react emotionally. He simply adjusted his stance, and Michael took another involuntary step back, like his body had learned that resistance here was pointless. The courtyard that had been Michael's stage was no longer his. The staff didn't look afraid of him anymore. They looked curious, relieved. Some looked ashamed. The robed witness avoided Michael's eyes completely, suddenly eager to be remembered as a neutral observer instead of a participant. Phones sat in a neat row on the table like surrendered weapons. Statements were being collected. Names were being written down. And Michael, who had forced my hand onto paper like he owned my future, was now being spoken to in the tone reserved for suspects. He tried once more, softer now, voice cracking at the edges. Richard, he said, let's talk man to man. Whatever you think happened, we can settle it. Quietly. My father didn't move closer. He didn't soften. He didn't raise his voice.
No, he said.
And that single syllable was the moment Michael finally understood what I had understood only seconds earlier. There would be no bargaining.
No charm. No backroom.
No private agreement. For the first time in my marriage, Michael wasn't directing the scene.
He was in it.
And he wasn't the lead anymore. He was being handled. I wish I could tell you that everything ended right there, that the truth wrapped itself neatly around justice and that healing began immediately. But real life doesn't resolve itself that cleanly. What happened in that courtyard was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more revealing. Because the moment Michael lost control, he didn't lose ambition. And the moment the law stepped in, it didn't mean the battle was over. It meant it had just changed arenas. There are things I still haven't told you. Moves made in silence. People who revealed themselves when power shifted. And a price that had to be paid before restoration could truly begin. In part 2, you'll see what happened after the gates closed. What Michael tried to do when the law tightened. What the board discovered when the books were opened. And the one decision I made that shocked even my father. So, I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have stayed silent this long or fought back sooner? Do you think betrayal inside marriage should ever be forgiven when power is involved? And most importantly, do you believe justice always wins, or only when someone powerful stands up? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. I read them all. And if you don't want to miss part 2, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now. Because what comes next changes everything.